Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we come to you this morning, give our hearts to you. We ask that you can be with us in this study. We're very thankful for this opportunity once again to look at our history of the past in this movement and to understand it. We know, Lord, we need your Spirit to teach us. And we ask, Lord, that all the human imperfections, that you can overrule those and that you can bring a divine element to our study, that we can see things out of your word that are true and clear. And we ask, Lord, that we can develop in character as we approach you each day. We ask for your Holy Spirit to teach and guide and lead us in this study, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Mm.
Well, good morning, everyone. We're continuing this study looking at the line of Moses. And so, and you can see it on the board behind me here. And we're going to go through this and we're going to actually compare this with a later line of Moses. So this is 1993 line of Moses. And we're going to compare this with what they had in 2000, well, around 2010, 2009, 2010, 2011. They had developed a lot more of these lines, and we're going to look at that as well. So the basic idea, just to review this, that Jeff has in this fairly simple line is that you have this darkness that leads to reform. And he's a little more clear that that darkness leads to reform, or that there's a connection between the reform line and the darkness. And then he's going to mark, and when you get that beginning of that reform, he calls that step one. And then you have step two is a revival. And step three is a judgment. So you have a reform line begin, a reform, a revival, a judgment. Then you have a disappointment, a backsliding. And then once again, you have another reform line that has a revival and a judgment connected with it. And the fourth is connected to the third, is it being a 3-1 combination. Now, what's not clear is where you would, what this relationship is with this fourth and the third. It appears to be different in some of the reform lines that later on. So this is a problem. And I always say it's a problem of magnification or perspective. That in each reform line, as we know, or in each waymark, in each step of a reform line, there is also a 3-step testing prophetic message that occurs. That is, you have different groups that are being tested, but you have, in every reform line, you would have a bigger reform line, but you also have events that occur within that reform line. And we've never really figured out a way of parsing these out. How do we know exactly in each reform line where we are? Now, one of the things that we use is a time prophecy. So in any major reform line, there's going to be a time of the end, and that time of the end is an important aspect of that reform line. It's based upon time. And so that point needs to be understood quite well. And it hasn't been in this paper really clearly defined, the connection of the time prophecy with the time of the end, or even really defining the time of the end at this point. That's going to be later when we get into the Time of the End magazine. You're going to see some of that, and that's because the study of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 is going to bring some of that out. Now, if you think about it, when you go back to 1989, Jeff is still just looking at reform lines. He's not addressing Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. That's going to develop from reform lines and from the study, particularly addressing the issues of the Sunday law that he sees in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So that's going to be 3 years later. But this idea of these reform lines has continued to persist in our time, but it hasn't always been the same. That is, the details on how we look at these reform lines has changed. And that's a large degree to our understanding of Millerite history. That is, we came to understand that Millerite history is the template where if you were looking at this paper and just trying to understand what he's saying about reform lines, even though he starts out with this message about Millerite history, he seems to focus mostly upon the line of Christ as the main pattern. And then even the choice of the various reform lines, some of these are reform lines that exist within other reform lines. And so they're not quite clear what these reform lines, how they're all connected. So at that time, it's just basically seeing that there's this pattern. And I don't think that it's important that he gets all the details right, because he just doesn't have enough information. But the idea is right. So you're going to see a disappointment after the third waymark. And depending on where you're zoomed in to a line is going to help you decide what that disappointment is, or is that disappointment a disappointment on a bigger line or a smaller line within a line? So for instance, in our history, where do we place the first disappointment? What event do we align up with that?
9/11.
Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so we would say Daniel 11. And now do we have other disappointments, though, that we've labeled parallel to the first disappointment in our history?
November 9th.
We have November 9th that we also label as a disappointment. And we've also labeled different things as disappointments. Now, what about where's the closed door in our line? So where's the shut door that would parallel October 22nd, 1844?
Appears to be July 18th.
Okay, so, well, if we're looking at the big line, we would say it's when Michael stands up, Daniel 12:1, and that would be future, after the Sunday law, after the loud cry. That would be the close of probation. That would be the shut door. We also have the Sunday law as a shut door, and we also have July 18th as a shut door, which we parallel with October 22nd, 1844 for this movement. So you can see in our line, we have various places where we can mark these disappointments and these shut doors. And why is that?
We really got into that with the priests, Levites, and Nethinim, closing probation for different people groups at different times.
Right. And it actually first started for the closed door for Seventh-day Adventists at the Sunday law. So this movement has taught that for a long time, that the closed door for Seventh-day Adventists is the Sunday law. And that's because it's very clear that it is. What we didn't see when we first put the Sunday law as the closed door is that we were actually looking at a different line. And we're going to get into that as we go through our line. So I bring these things up because we know that in our line, however we understand it at this point, maybe it's not all clear to everyone, but we know that we can zoom in on our line, we can zoom out to the big line, and we also have different groups. Now, this is also true in Millerite history, and that was something that wasn't well understood, the relationship between Millerite history and the various groups, and our line in the various groups. And also, we had this problem where we were teaching this line of the Nethinim, which in my view was there is no line of the Nethinim. So that was a misunderstanding of, or a misapplication of the use of the Nethinim, of who they were. There is the Nethinim. They do symbolize something, but they don't have their own separate line, like the priests and the Levites do. So understanding what these lines are was part of the problem that we had with the falling away with Mark Bruce, and then those followers of his who later fell away. And even later on, there was this continuous falling away. We could go back to 2014. But as these falling aways progressed, a big problem was that there was a misunderstanding of the lines, and people were using the lines in ways that you really shouldn't be able to use them. That was, I would say, a basic misunderstanding of the lines and what you could do with them. And you could see this with Mark Bruce, a complete distortion of the lines, and with Parminder, complete distortion of the lines. That is, not really using the Millerite line as a model. That is, we used the Millerite line early on, but as time went on, you could see almost no similarity between our line and the Millerite line. You couldn't just line them up. And this was a problem. So as we go back and look at this line of Moses, what we're going to do is we're going to look at this line again, try to mark out what these events are. And then we're going to look at the line of Moses as it was understood, over 15 years later. And even then, if you look at 2009 to 2011, I have charts from all those years. They're all pretty similar in that period. But when you get to 2014 and 15, and we start understanding Midnight and the Midnight Cry into 2016, you're going to see that the lines, our relationship to the Millerite line is adjusted in a number of ways, and still not quite clearly understood. So we're going to look at that, and not today, but we're going to look at that later on as we move through these different reform lines. But this line of Moses, I think, is actually a very good example of a line that's not well understood, where we've zoomed in to a smaller line and mistaken it for the whole line. And the question is, how do we mark a whole line? How do we know what a whole line is?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I guess when you see a second judgment on one line.
Okay, so we would, but the thing is, we have lots of judgments that happen within lines. And so there isn't just, so to figure out which is the bigger line is something we have never really defined, because I don't think we even realized we had a problem. Now, the way that I've done it, I was talking about before we started the recording here, is that I see that there is actually a chain of lines that goes from the first reform line, which is the creation of the world. Instead of the time of the end, it's the time of the beginning. But it sets up the pattern for these reform lines that we see. We have all the different elements of that. I'm not going to go into that reform line now. We might later on go through and see if we can see all these bigger reform lines. But I would say that the way that we do it, just the simple way, is we have a reform line, and then it's going to be followed by 4 generations, or some symbol that's similar to 4 generations. It may not be 4 actual generations in this point of time, but it's going to be a symbol of that. And you're going to have a falling away in the first generation, and then you're going to have what I would call a progressive destruction of 4 that's going to lead then to the next major reform line. So in trying to understand that, you're going to have to understand what the first generation is, and to see that the first generation is a connecting link that connects you. So it's part of that reform line, but it's connecting you to the first generation of another reform line. That is, what happens in a reform line is the fourth is actually the first generation. And I think that we haven't seen that clearly in our history. We haven't understood this well of how you connect these different reform lines. Now, they're also connected by prophecy. So that would be another element. We would need a clear time prophecy to connect these different reform lines to. The other element, which comes from the study of the time prophets, is these dispensations. So major reform lines are connected with changes in dispensation. So we can look at some of these smaller reform lines, and they're going to have the elements of these larger reform lines. But if they're not attached to a time prophecy, and they're not attached to a change of dispensation, I wouldn't place them as the main reform lines that we would use. These would be reform lines within reform lines, marking out particular truths. So some of the things that we mark as reform lines are illustrations of reform lines. That is, they have the same characteristics, because in every generation, God's dealings with men are ever the same. But some of these reform lines are not what I call a major reform line. That is, they're not connected with this whole chain of reform lines. But they give us information that we can use and still lay them over top of our reform lines to understand how they're structured. So, one of the things we'll see and I'm just going to switch to one of these charts. So here is a chart that has all these different reform lines. And there's quite a few of these different charts. Some are quite different from each other. This is an earlier one, I believe. And it's going to have the reform line of Nehemiah and it's calling it Nehemiah when it's actually the reform line of Cyrus, Darius, or it's the reform line of the 3 decrees. So naming it the reform line of Nehemiah seemed kind of odd to me. And then you're going to see that it's going to have the reform line of Moses, of Jesus, of Noah, of Elijah, of Miller, and then our reform line. And it's going to be quite different in the way that we lay this out from other ways that we've done it in the past and also in the future. And then when you look at this template here that they have, the time of the end, they're going to have a time of the end. They're going to have this darkness sort of after the time of the end with this increase of knowledge, this increase of light. Then they're going to have the first waymark, and it's going to say worldwide, a reform. It's going to be a heavenly being comes down. They're going to have what they say here, the fundamentals, but we're going to say later it's the laying of the foundation. And then you're going to have the work of the enemies, then a revival, which is going to be local. Manifestation of the power of God that happens between the second and the third waymark. And then a judgment, what they call judgment A at the third waymark. A number 7 is going to be manifested in some ways, a disappointment. And then there's going to be a work and then a backsliding. And then you're going to have a reform that happens in troublous times. And that reform is preceding the revival that's going to happen, that's called the fourth waymark. And that's obviously going to be the fourth and the second. And then you have judgment B, which is the church being judged. So this type of description of a reform line has some problems with it. That is, it doesn't fit in every reform line. And we've also applied it in different ways of what the fourth is. So just to kind of go over this, in Nehemiah's history, what they call Nehemiah, they're actually marking the fourth decree, Artaxerxes' decree, as the fourth, which is the first generation after a reform line. In Moses, they're marking the Ten Commandments, which I wouldn't have done in the line of Moses, and we'll see why, as the fourth. I would have actually looked at these other things as symbols within this reform line, or that is, they zoomed in on the line of Moses and didn't realize they needed to zoom out. And then the same problems happens here. They're going to place Pentecost as the fourth. So they're going to line that up with Artaxerxes' decree. And in the line of Jesus, I would have the destruction of Jerusalem as the fourth, or connected with the fourth. So there's lots of things that I would have done differently. Then in the line of Noah, and this is one that really needs to be studied in a lot more detail, because I think I wouldn't have put the 40 days of rain. Again, this is zoomed in too much. So you have to decide where you are in this line. But so I would think that this is actually a smaller reform line, which is in a bigger reform line of the line of Noah. It's not wrong. It's just that it's zoomed in. So you need to know which group you're looking at. In the line of Elijah, I don't look at Elijah as a major reform line, even though it does have a 3.5-year period attached to it. It's more a history or an illustration of other reform lines. And I would look at Elijah as a parallel to John the Baptist, which we've always done. And John the Baptist is not a major reform line. It's a reform line within a reform line. And then you're going to see Miller. And here, they're going to line up the fourth with our reform line, which I would argue is actually a major reform line. So it's another reform line. It's not actually the fourth within Miller's reform line. The fourth actually would line up with 1863. So that's one of the problems that we have, is we're zoomed in or we're zoomed out, and we're not clear where we are in the bigger lines. And that was a major problem in our line. So in going back to, we're going to go back to the paper here first. And I just want to read some of the things that we had read earlier and try to line them up with this reform line. So when you look at what he's presenting here, and of course, we're not watching a presentation. We're watching, because we have no presentations from 1993 that I know of. We just have.
Theodore?
Yeah.
You're using the green chart. Have you looked at the blue chart?
Yes, I have the blue chart too. We're going to look at that as well.
The blue chart is a little bit later.
Yeah, exactly. So
okay, just
yeah, because I have the blue chart, but I wanted to look at an earlier one, and then we will look at the blue chart and see some of the differences that happened. So once we lay out the line of Moses and try to understand what he was doing in 1993, where all we have is his statements and his lines, the statements being from the spirit of prophecy in the Bible, and the lines that he drew out, and then trying to understand exactly what this means, what he thinks it means or how he's applying it. It's not very clear to me. And I don't know how clear it was to him at the time. So how much Jeff really understood the significance of the statements that he was making, or how he was laying out the line. Because I would think this is just some of his initial ideas because they definitely did change over time. But thanks for that. That's a good point. So when we go back to this line, we're dealing with the line of Moses. There's going to be the darkness leads to reform, and the darkness here, the quote that Jeff is choosing, has to do with, one is the Sabbath was disregarded, but also they're in captivity, right? They're in bondage. And it's because they're in bondage that the Sabbath has been disregarded, because they're slaves. It's very difficult being slaves to keep the Sabbath. And so over time, the importance of the Sabbath becomes less and less. So, and it says, the Sabbath had been generally disregarded, and the exactions of their taskmasters made its observance apparently impossible, right? So this is not that they didn't know about the Sabbath, but God wanted to restore that to his people. And then we're going to have this revival, and they use the miracles as the revival. So that there's this revival that's going on because of the acts of Moses in presenting these miracles. And then they're going to jump to this judgment. The judgment is the judgment that would happen at the Passover. So this is connected to the plagues and so forth, right? So the death of the firstborn. So and you have that whole history there just kind of summed up in one paragraph from the patriarchs and prophets. And then you have the disappointment. So the disappointment, based upon a statement in the spirit of prophecy, is the disappointment at the Red Sea. So terror filled the hearts of Israel. Some cried unto the Lord, but far greater part had hastened to Moses with their complaints. So, I mean, there is definitely a disappointment as such at the Red Sea, but is that then parallel to the first disappointment is sort of the question we would have to ask. And so she talks about this now. Even as he wrought for the Israelites in leading them from Egypt, in the great disappointment of 1844, the faith of his people was tested, as was that of the Hebrews at the Red Sea. So we take a parallel that Ellen White has given between the disappointment at the Red Sea and the great disappointment of 1844. And the question is, from that statement, can we take this reform line and just place it at 1844, that saying that the Red Sea is the third step in that whole reform line? So that would be the question we would have to ask, and then try to answer that based upon the spirit of prophecy and God's word. Is that the only application you can make in the history of Moses for the great disappointment of 1844? And we can see actually from other spirit of prophecy statements that she makes other parallels that would appear not to fit this as the primary application. But this is the statement that he's chosen, and so he's placed it there in that way. So we're going to have to decide about that.
So would we put the golden calf there also at October 22nd, 1844?
Yeah, well, and see, it depends which group you're looking at.
Because that's a Sunday law too.
Right, exactly. Because we would know that the golden calf would parallel that. But we also have other events that we have to take into consideration. So one of the things that I would look at is that the Israelites are going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And we have to understand why that happened. And that would be a failure in the first generation. Now we know that there is really one generation that dies in the wilderness. There isn't 4 generations as such. But I would say that where we're going to put the next major reform line is, which we would have to decide how we're going to do that. That would be the reform line of Joshua. So we have to decide, where are we placing Joshua in relation to Moses? And one of the things that we can do with these reform lines is we can actually zoom out. And what's the biggest reform line in the Bible?
Line of Christ.
From Eden to Eden.
Eden to Eden, right? So that is a reform line in and of itself. So these other reform lines that we call major reform lines are really just part of a larger reform line. And so as we zoom in, this idea of fractals, that as you zoom in, you see the same characteristics that you see on a larger scale. The question then is somewhat one, just because you have a reform line and it's part of a bigger reform line, doesn't mean it's wrong to look at that reform line in that way. So you can zoom in and see those characteristics and parallel different events with October 22nd, 1844. And then you can zoom out a little bit and you have now this larger reform line, and another event will have that characteristic. And then you can zoom out again and another event would have that characteristic. So that is the thing that, so we're not saying that something's wrong just because somebody zoomed in and made a reform line and saw that reform line. That doesn't mean it's an error. It just means that we need to know when we're zoomed in or where we are in the bigger scheme of things.
Every conflict with Satan will follow roughly the same pattern.
Yes. And one of the things we noticed is that not all reform lines have all the same characteristics. And of course, that would be because not all darknesses are the same. There's different darknesses. But also some reform lines are really just smaller reform lines in a bigger reform line. They're not going to have all the characteristics. So there are many reform lines, for instance, in the line of Christ. I think that part of the thing that has to be understood is the time prophecy element. So where do we put these time prophecies that mark these major reform lines? But we also need to be really clear about what is being accomplished by each reform line and why. And again, that's not a question that we've really asked. We've seen the patterns, but we haven't understood the significance of the development of truth with all these reform lines. I know I haven't seen it all. I know that as I continue to study it, it becomes clearer and clearer. But it's not something that we really ever addressed. Why all these different reform lines? What are they trying to accomplish? And even the personal reform lines of a prophet, which are typical of the end of the world, because a prophet is writing more about our time than his own time, but also even the events of his life are types of the end of the world. And even some of the things that we haven't really looked at as reform lines are reform lines that we just haven't addressed. Because we have a reform line of Manasseh, for instance. He's a part of a reform line. He has a personal reform line, but he's also a part of another reform line that we have never really looked at. So there is a number of things that we have to address in that sense. So we have the statement in the spirit of prophecy dealing with the Red Sea, and then we're going to have a backsliding. So we know that there's a backsliding after the miracle at the Red Sea. And this is natural. Every time that God has worked and operated, whether it's in our own lives or whether it's on a reform line, there's a time of height in which God has taught us something, and then he's going to allow us to test that we're going to go through some experience that's going to, I can't think of a better term than cut us down a notch, but God's not really trying to do that.
Understanding.
Yeah, he's trying to test us. Did we really understand that lesson or not? And we can see this in so many different reform lines. I mean, obviously we know Elijah is one that we use of his victory at Mount Carmel and then his disappointment afterwards. But there's lots of them where people are being tested in these disappointments. And the question is, how do we fit that into the reform lines? Are they just minor stories, or is that reform line a bigger part of something else? Now, and then what she's going to reference here is the history of the wilderness life of Israel was chronicled for the benefit of the Israel of God to the close of time. Now, the history of the wilderness life, how long does that last?
40 years.
40 years. And yet when she mentions it here, this wilderness life, but when Jeff is addressing his reform line, he doesn't really address it at all, other than just the initial beginning of that wilderness, some of the things that happened when they first get into the wilderness. So we need to understand the relationship between what happens with Moses and what happens at the end with the crossing of the Jordan, because we have the crossing of the Red Sea and we have the crossing of the Jordan. How are those two related to each other within a reform line? Are they two completely separate reform lines, or are they connected in some way? And one of the things that we talked about in this movement was when we had Jeff and Parminder, what were the parallels that people tried to make between Jeff and Parminder? What are some of them? What was Parminder, before we knew what was happening? What was Jeff doing back in March of 2019, just before his retirement?
Jeff must decrease and Parminder must increase.
Okay, so what different illustrations did we use for that? First one, of course, would be John the Baptist, Christ, right? So that would be implying that Jeff was typified by John the Baptist and Parminder was typified by Christ. Correct? That's how it was being presented?
Correct.
Okay. Who else? What other parallels did we use? Well, who typified John the Baptist?
William Miller and I forget what the second one. Was it James White or was it somebody else?
Okay, so John the Baptist was typified by Elijah, and then Christ was typified by Elisha, right? So we had Elijah and Elisha. We had John the Baptist and Christ. We had Miller and James White, or sometimes Miller and Snow, depending on how people looked at it. So mostly I think it was Miller and Snow, though I saw other people using James White. And then we had Moses and Joshua, right? Now, when we look at all of these, if we have Moses and Joshua, what are we implying about the relationship between Moses and Joshua? In that reform, is that a reform line from Moses to Joshua?
Well, if you're gonna compare them in that way, then yes, it is one reform line.
Right. So, but Jeff doesn't do that with the reform line of Moses. He doesn't have Moses and Joshua in that reform line. And even when we look at Elijah in the reform line of Elijah, we don't really have Elijah and Elisha as part of the same reform line, right? We have the reform line of Elijah. But we don't, in the time of Christ, we don't have a reform line of John the Baptist by himself, and then a reform line of Christ by himself. they're part of the same reform line, correct?
Correct.
And if we're using Miller and Snow, again, they're part of the same reform line. So there's an inconsistency on how we have applied, these people, this transition, this passing of the torch, or probably the better of the cloak, I guess.
Mantle.
The mantle, right? The mantle, that's the word, from one to another. And so sometimes we have them within the same reform line. Sometimes they appear to be not part of the same reform line. So there's that inconsistency. So we have an inconsistency regarding where we are zoomed in, but we also don't have some of those characteristics. We see them basically in apparently different reform lines because of how we've zoomed in. So that's an issue that has to be addressed. So you have in this line here, the line of Moses, Jeff then has number 82 is that they're going to sanctify themselves in humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And that's going to be a reform. And then it's followed by a shaking, which is Mount Sinai. And so that shaking Mount Sinai is the prior to the giving of the law. So he doesn't really explain why he has this here, why he's putting the shaking there. And then he's going to have the giving of the law, the 10 Commandments labeled as Pentecost. But as we said before, that may not be the case. And then finally, the judgment is going to be this, what happens with this apostasy with the golden calf. So that ends up being that judgment comes with that apostasy. And I'm not sure that this makes sense, from my perspective, to put all these things here as these waymarks that we're going to see. And then we have the command was communicated to Moses, number 85, dealing with the building of the tabernacle. So you see, and then he's going to jump to the Jordan, leaving their encampment in the acacia groves of Shittim. The host descended to the border of the Jordan. So they're going to have the Jordan crossing here. And then the entering into Canaan, the circumcision as this sign, and then finally the taking of Jericho. So when we look at this line, has he put any of these latter things on this line from 85 to 88?
No.
So what is that telling us? What is he trying to say, dealing with, because he talks about the crossing of the Jordan and all these things, but he hasn't placed them on this line of Moses at all. Does anybody know why?
So we would think they would be on a separate line, and he just didn't draw one out.
Yeah, but he's talking here about the line of Moses. And so he mentions these events, but he doesn't even put them there. And I would have put them there. I would have put the crossing of the Jordan in the second group. That's the way that I would have looked at it, in the way that he's done it. So I'm just saying that there's something that he's not telling us, or something that we don't understand about how he's dealing with this line, of why he mentions these events but doesn't put them on the line. Now, I can't read into Jeff's mind in 1993 or any time, but I don't have enough information. I don't have any of his presentations. We don't have newsletters. In 1993, really, this is just a result of Bible study that had been going on for about 4 years, in my understanding of it. So this is just basically him writing out his initial ideas that they had come to understand, and yet it seems incomplete. It would have been really nice if we had some presentation from 1993, but we don't. What we do have is later presentations where we can see how he applies these things. So I'm going to go to the whiteboard again. We're going to do what we did last time, but try to We have a bit more time this time. So it was basically a review, but I think very, very helpful to go through that review. And just got to get this camera set up.
Well, we still have the Time of the Inn magazine and the final Rise and Fall of the King of the North book that, stretch out his thoughts also.
Yes. So we are going to go through the Time of the Inn magazine. Now, just a question on that. We have a 2002 edition of the Time of the Inn magazine. What I'm going to look at is, instead of that, I'm going to look at the initial articles that were published in 1996 from January to November. So there was 11 articles that were published, and I have PDFs of that. I'm going to send that out to everyone because we'll probably get into that next week. Start looking at the Time of the Inn magazine. So we're going to look at things 3 years down the line from this initial paper. But the focus then on the Time of the Inn magazine is Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So there's definitely a different understanding there. And of course, it's pre 9/11 again. So we'll have a look at that.
At one time, I tried to compare the Time of the Inn magazine with the final Rise and Fall of the King of the North book, and I really could not make good comparisons. It seemed like his thought process was very different in both productions.
Yeah, when did he write The Rise and Fall of the King of the North?
As near as I could tell, it's about the same time.
About the same time? Okay. Okay. And that book I have not read, even though I used to have it. I haven't read
I can send you a PDF of it.
Yeah, I have a PDF of it, but I used to actually have the book. But so I can read it. We're obviously going to have to look at that as well.
I have a copy that I can lend you if you want.
Yeah, the copy I gave you, or
No, the one that Kelly gave me.
oh, Kelly gave you one. I thought I gave you a copy, but maybe
No.
someone else. Must have been someone else that got my copy. But yeah, I don't need the hardcover. I can just read the PDF. But anyway, we're going to draw this line here again. Well, it's up there, but I'm going to draw it out. Staying very good.
Just with the Y, E-G-Y. Egypt, E-G-Y.
Yeah, doesn't matter. I'm drawing this over again.
Okay. That looks better.
Okay, good. So we're going to look at the line of Moses. I'm going to try to draw a little neater and write a little neater. So we have, of course, the darkness. We're going to have this first way mark. Now, so what is he marking here as the first way mark? If you remember from his notes there. Because it has this darkness, and this darkness is bondage and breaking the Sabbath. So what's the first way mark? What's his reasoning there? Does he clearly say what the first one is? Because you have darkness that leads to reform. Does he clearly tell you what the first one is? People are looking at their notes, I hope.
He does not tell you. He just puts number 1.
Right. So he's not going to tell you specifically what's marking that. He's just going to say that it's going to lead to this reform. So you have the start of a reform. Now, what's going to cause the revival? So we'll just say here, reform. So you're going to have revival. And what's the revival going to be?
The second message.
Okay. Yeah. So he's going to say it's going to be the miracles, right? So you're going to have miracles. Okay. So that's what he says in number 77. And then he's going to have judgment. Now, what's the judgment? It's going to be the plagues. Now, particularly, we would have to say it would be the death of the firstborn. So that would be the judgment. And then what does he mark as the disappointment? So we're going to have a disappointment. So I'm just going to put it here like this.
The
So what's
encampment by the Red Sea.
So that's going to be the Red Sea. So you have the Red Sea disappointment. And then what's he going to have is the backsliding. So he's going to have the backsliding next. So you're going to have backsliding.
The complaining in the desert.
Okay, so they're complaining. So after the disappointment and God has delivered them, they're starting to complain. He doesn't go into a lot of details about what those things are. We know that one thing that they're going to complain about is they need food. And now, so one of the issues that comes up later is you're going to have a number 7 attached to this. And what is that number 7 going to be connected to after they cross the Red Sea? Does anybody know? I mean, it's not in this line. But connected with the complaining, what's going to happen? What are they complaining about?
7 days, the manna falling. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, so they're going to have the manna, and they're going to have all those quail come, right? They're going to have the feast of the quail, and then they're going to have the manna that's left, right? And that's going to be about the Sabbath, right? That's when they're going to be given the Sabbath prior to the law. They're going to start observing the Sabbath again.
Yes.
Okay, so he doesn't go into the detail about that in this presentation, but later on they're going to be marking that in this line of Moses. So they're going to have a backsliding. So the reform that he's going to connect is this reform here. So he's going to have a reform, and it's not clear to me exactly what event does he use number 82 for the reform. I can't remember what we read there.
The preparation before God's appearance.
Okay, right. So there's a preparation. So this, I think this is referring to the 3 days preparation before they get the law.
That's right.
So this is the 10 Commandments. So you're going to have the 10 Commandments as number 4, which of course is still number 2. And this is number 1. And then what's going to be the judgment?
The mixed multitude.
Okay, so they're dealing with the mixed multitude, but what in particular happens in this context?
Yeah, well, it's the golden calf.
Right, so you're going to have the golden calf. So you're going to have the worship of the calf.
That's interesting that it happens almost simultaneous with the giving of the law.
Yes, yeah, it's happening at the time Moses is in the mountains receiving the 10 Commandments. Now, in later times, he does this differently. He marks this giving of the 10 Commandments. He's going to mark the 4th one, not the giving of the commandments the first time, but the giving of the commandments the second time as this event. So in this initial 1993 edition, this is basically what we have. So I want to look at it, 15 years later or so. So we're going to look at 2 different versions of this. Now, I don't want to go to this one yet. I want to go to this one. Nope, not there. Great. Okay, so I know you're looking at the blue one. I want to go to this green one first. Okay, so in this version, we're just going to look at the line of Moses. And we can see that he's going to mark a little bit more detail. He's going to say it's the line of Moses, beginning of the history of ancient Israel. So he now has this idea that it's connected to some other reform line, the reform line of Christ, which is the end of the history of ancient Israel. So when we have reform lines like this that are connected thematically, what does that mean? Why would we connect? What's connecting the line of Moses to the line of Christ? Why is he doing this? Other than just the fact that this is the beginning of the history of ancient Israel and the other one's the end of the history of ancient Israel. What connects these things?
There's parallels in the timelines.
Yeah, there's parallels in these timelines. Now, all reform lines have similar parallels, but there are some very specific parallels between Moses and Christ.
Beginning shows the end from the beginning.
Right. Yeah, and so we know that both Moses and Christ are involved in the slaughter of the innocents. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. They both end a particular type of time prophecy, or they're connected to a particular type of time prophecy. Moses is connected to the end of the 430 years. And Christ is going to be connected to the end of the 70 weeks, right? So there are these time prophecies that they're connected to. And then also we have, now here, when we look at the birth of Moses and the birth of Jesus, there are some things that are not well defined here. Now, we also have the birth of John the Baptist and the birth of Aaron. Are Aaron and John the Baptist connected in any way? Here he has Moses and John the Baptist connected. But he also has Moses connected with Christ. What's the significance of Aaron in relationship to John the Baptist? Is there a significance there? So something we have to think about. What's that?
Aaron was before the slaughter of the innocents.
Yes, Aaron's before the slaughter of the innocents. So is John the Baptist. And there's a bunch of things here in this line of Moses that we're going to look at this week, and really try to understand. So here they're adding some details, but I don't think that the details are well defined why they've done what they've done. God gave us some things and we just kind of accepted it, but we haven't fully understood it at this point. Now, some of this is really hard to read on this green chart because it's not, it's a PDF and it's not really clear. So you're going to have Moses' education being paralleled with the shepherds and the three wise men of Jesus as dealing with this increase of light. So I don't know if I would take Moses' education as an increase of light. I think there's other things that I would have marked, but that's what they marked there. And then they have this first one is marked as Moses, right? So we have Moses now who's being marked as the first message, just like John the Baptist is the first message in the time of Christ. Cyrus is the first decree in the line of the decrees. We're going to have to deal with those in the future. But right now we have Moses. So when it comes to the line that we have here, he doesn't really mark Moses on the line per se. But Moses is obviously there in 1993. And he's also going to still address Sabbath reform. So the issue that Jeff, still 15 some years later, is still seeing Sabbath reform as the foundation, right? Now, he's not calling this always the foundation. Foundations of the temple, foundations of the ark, all these different lines have the foundation, the laying of a foundation. But there's a work that's going to be done. So Moses is going to introduce some Sabbath reform. And he's going to Pharaoh to ask if they can go worship their God on a 3 days journey out in the wilderness. And because of that, there's going to be this increase of labor. So that red line there is the work of the enemies. So we're going to see this. And then you're going to have the second, right? So what's being marked here as the second in this line of Moses that you see on the green chart? What do they have marked there?
The plagues.
Well, they don't actually have anything marked there. They just have the 10 plagues are going to come afterwards. But he doesn't actually mark anything as the second on this chart, right? He just has this increase of labor, but he doesn't put something labeling that second way mark. And then it's going to be the plagues. Now, the plagues are going to occur between this increase of labor and the judgment of the firstborn. So now he's separating these out. When it comes to the judgment, he just puts specifically the judgment of the firstborn. And he puts the plague as something that precedes the judgment of the firstborn. So placing that, he's going to place the plagues, as you see, triumphal entry, animals going into the ark. There's all these types of things that he's going to look at. And then the judgment of the firstborn is a closed door. Now, one of the things that we said that wasn't well defined in this line of Moses is who is being reformed.
The Israelites.
Okay. Now, when we deal with the judgment of the firstborn, this is on Pentecost. So we know it's a test for God's people. So there's a lot of logic to say that this judgment of the firstborn, Pentecost, or Passover, pardon me, is a test. But the question is it the third test or is it the second test? Right, in that context. So I'm not saying one way or the other what it is. We're going to try to work through this week. But we just look at it for now for what it is. He has the judgment of the firstborn. And And then we're going to have the disappointment at the Red Sea afterwards, the sanctification at Sinai. And then notice he has the golden calf preceding the fourth, right? So the fourth is going to be the 10 Commandments. But what 10 Commandments is this? If you have the golden calf and Moses destroys the commandments as number one of this last group, what is the 10 Commandments being marked as this number 4?
It's the second.
That's the second, right? So you're going to have Moses destroys the commandments. So this would have been a work of reform. And then technically you're going to have this this work of reform, but you're going to have a rebellion following it, which he doesn't generally do, because you have this work of reform. It's going to normally lead to what? What does the work of reform lead to? In the way that he set up just the main 1, 2, 3, it would be a revival, right? So he has this rebellion preceding it, but then I guess you would have to say that the revival is going to be the second, but he has a work of rebellion leading up to a revival, not a work of reform. So there are some problems with how he's looking at this and sorting this through. He doesn't, I don't believe that Jeff, it was clear of where he was zoomed in into these reform lines. Now this started to become clearer later on. So I think that Jeff, as time went on, came to understand this much better than he did at this time. You know, this is around the time I came into the movement. And then you're going to finally have the judgment, and it's going to be the judgment of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So it's obviously a different judgment, because the one that he has as the judgment has to do with the judgment regarding the worship of the golden calf. So you can see that this reform line here is not the same for Moses. Now we're going to go to a newer one, and this one's not that much newer. This is 2011, but it has some different details in it. This one's a lot clearer, easier to read too. So here we have the great reformatory movements, and I'm just going to look at how he lays out this, the pattern. So we have a life or death test for the generation. So he's going to have a time of the end. He's going to have this darkness. Now, again, you can see he puts the time of the end, and then he puts this darkness that's being removed. So he doesn't clearly mark like he did in 1993 that you have a period of darkness that leads to reform, but I think that's how he was understanding it. So it's a little bit different than how we came to understand the darkness. That we would put, you have darkness, then you have the time of the end, then you have the arrival of the first angel's message. But even in 2011, this chart anyway from 2011 doesn't clearly show that. But it is going to show this increase of knowledge happening after the time of the end. But to have the darkness preceding this period of reform rather than preceding the time of the end. And then you're going to have this worldwide reform. And then the foundations are going to be laid. And then what's this heavenly being referring to? Why is there a heavenly being?
It's referring to Revelation 10 with the little book.
Okay, so this would be the little book in the line of the Millerites. In different lines, it's going to be different things.
The burning bush for Moses.
Yeah. Now, yeah, and you also could connect it to what happens on August 11th, 1840 as well. If you're looking at the empowerment of the first message, that could be understood in that way as well, because we sort of understand 9/11 that way. But anyway, we're going to have to deal with those reform lines later. And then you're going to have a revival, manifestation of the power of God. So that's how he was looking at the plagues, as you'll see. And then a judgment. And he has judgment A, judgment B, Judgment A is going to be this general judgment. There's going to be a number 7 attached, a disappointment attached to that as well. And then a work that's going to happen, then a backsliding, then a reform. So that's basically the same as the other one was. So when we look at the line of Moses here, and again, he's going to be the beginning of the history of ancient Israel, and he's going to go back to the line of Christ, and he ties it together by this light blue line going down. So he doesn't put the line of Christ right next to the line of Moses on this chart. Again, he's going to have Moses' education. So this isn't going to be that much different than what we saw on the other chart. It's going to be very similar. Jesus descends for circumcision. That's going to be dealing with Moses, the Sabbath reform. And then this glorious manifestation of the power of God in the great controversy. Now, they have this line going from the birth of Moses to the judgment of the firstborn. I mean, this would refer to, I think, much more than just that history. And it would go farther, I would think. But the Exodus, I mean, where would we put the glorious manifestation of the power of God? Stephen, like, if you're going to say where the glorious manifestation of the power of God happened in Millerite history, we would put it from August 11th, 1840 to October 22nd, 1844. So where would we put it in the history of Moses?
Yeah, I was just about to check that it says there, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 340.
Yeah.
Now, I know that Ellen White, she talks about the divine manifestation, the greatest divine manifestation of God's power, but she applies it to Mount Sinai rather than to the 10 plagues.
Right.
So I'm just checking to see, I want to check just to see, is that?
And there's the great controversy 6:11 as well.
Yes. So I just want to check now.
Yep.
I'll get back to you in a wee minute, just if that's applying to Mount Sinai or to the 10 plagues. I think it's Mount Sinai.
Yeah, and I think she applies it from that whole history of coming out of Egypt, going to Mount Sinai. That's the way that I understood her wonderful manifestation of the power of God, glorious manifestation of the power of God in Great Controversy, the 6:11. And that we have on both of these charts. That's on the earlier chart too. So we have the judgment of the firstborn, and then we're going to have the seventh day, the manna test, the Red Sea. These are kind of placed together, even though they're not all at the same time, because the Red Sea is going to be first. Then they're going to have a month later, on the 15th day of the second month, they're going to have the test with the manna, and that's with the quails. And then, of course, they're going to wander in the wilderness for a bit. They're going to travel down to Mount Sinai, and they're going to receive the 10 Commandments. And again, here, this one, they don't mark exactly what the first one is. But in the one that we looked at earlier, what was the first of those last three? What did they mark as number one? So they don't mark it here on the blue chart. So what did they mark here on the green chart? Does anybody remember?
Moses breaks the commandments.
So the destruction of the 10 Commandments. And you would then have, of course, the whole issue with the golden calf. So that's not listed on this chart. So it's taken off for some reason on a chart that's a couple of years older. And then you're going to have the 10 Commandments as this fourth one. And again, the judgment of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram as the third step in that fourth waymark. Yeah, so never since man was created has there been witness such a divine manifestation of the power of God of divine power as when the law was proclaimed from Sinai, Patriarchs and Prophets 340. So if we're going to put a manifestation of the power of God in the line of Moses, we would put it at the giving of the law. That would be that event. And if you're going to look at that, what's that?
Well, certainly you can say the 10 plagues were a manifestation of God's power as well, but
Yeah.
I think it's more specifically, she brings it out at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, and so he's using this quote from Patriarchs and Prophets, but he's having it before Mount Sinai. So he's applying this glorious manifestation of the power of God to the plagues and to this history, but he doesn't apply it to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So that seems a little bit peculiar. Now, these types of things, when I look at this early work in this movement, and I consider this early, even though this is only like 10 years ago. When we look at Millerite history has a great understanding of many, many things, but their perspective or their closeness to the event of their prediction is limiting their view, right? They become very myopic, right? They're not seeing past 1843, or at least past, even March 21st, 1843, where they believe that the end of the 2300 days, that's the farthest it can go. And they have things that they should know or they should see that they can't see. And that's just because of their perspective. They're not going to be able to see everything. Now, also, we're in a reform line. So one of the things about a reform line is that our understanding is still unfolding. And this is the thing that we have to be careful about even now. So we know that God is giving us light. And we know that new light, because that's what this study has clearly shown, is that new light is an unfolding of old light. And the new does not contradict the old. But yet when you see something more clearly, can it appear on the surface like a contradiction?
Just for a short time, though.
Yeah. So, when we look at the thing that I was amazed when I started reading Miller and the pioneers' work prior to 1844, is I had this impression that it was full of all kinds of error. That's the impression that the church gave me, which is why I never read Miller. But when I started reading him, I realized he was correct. He was right about everything he was doing, except that his perspective was distorted by an assumption. But that if he had been able to just have his eyes open to see what was going to happen, everything would have drawn logically from what he taught. That is, Miller laid a foundation that allowed the increase of light that happened after the disappointment to even occur. Without the foundation being laid by Miller, you couldn't have had the understanding that unfolded to Seventh-day Adventists. And to me, that's an extremely important point, because if you're going to look at this movement, and we're going to parallel Jeff with Miller, we have to recognize that just because Jeff doesn't see everything 100% correctly, doesn't mean that he's not correct. He is correct in the only way that matters. One is he's following God. He's in a reform line. He's doing what God asks him to do. And he's revealing the light as God has given it. He doesn't necessarily understand everything. He doesn't understand all of the implications of what this message means or how it's going to develop, because that is God's work. But what is happening is we can now look back and say, even though there are some details that are different, this is pretty amazing, these parallels. So we're not looking at this and rejecting it because we see that there are some changes that obviously came after that, especially once we started to understand Millerite history better. And you can see this here when you look at this chart and you go down and you look at the bottom where you have Miller and today, you're going to see some differences and these differences, these changes happened in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. When these people were leaving this movement, beginning in 2014, one of the things that they I guess they felt or they thought is that Jeff had begun to depart from the message that he had first given, and that they had light that Jeff didn't have. So they believed that they had light on Joel, or Joel, however you say the name of the prophet, the book of Joel. And then we had this new light coming in regarding midnight, the midnight cry actually, which was brought in by Emiliano, at least partly, but it started to be developed in a way that many of the people, like Jamal, weren't ready to accept. One is their focus was primarily upon Islam. That was their interest. And there was also some problems with how Jeff understood Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, that they didn't agree with. And you can see that in many of the people, not so much the leadership, but the people who had been following those. They've actually gone further back in Adventist history, or maybe not further back, but they've taken some errors from Adventist history because of their focus upon Islam. And they basically have taken and adopted Uriah Smith's view of the understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. A lot of people who are in this movement have actually reverted to Uriah Smith's view. I don't know how many people are aware of that. Dwight, are you aware of that?
Turkey view.
Yeah, Turkey, right? So now they want to have Islam involved. And Dwight, are you aware of any of that in the Northwest there?
Quite a bit.
Yeah. So, and that's what I've noticed, is that there's this been rejection of Jeff's idea of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. And that's because many of the people in the movement, they were interested in Millerite history, the pioneers, historic Adventism, and of course the 2520 was a part of that. And they would look at Jeff's ideas as basically a departure from the foundation. So
One of the biggest promulgators of Uriah Smith in this area has been Don Frost.
Yeah. So, so there are all these different, and Don Frost wasn't really ever a part of this movement either.
Well,
He sort of took over. He came in as the movement was just about to split, like a couple of years before, and he wasn't really. What's that?
what was sad about that with Don Frost,
Mhm.
he came up into this area late June, early July one year. And he was, of course, from Maryland.
Yeah.
Now, the issue that I had was that the one that brought Don Frost front and center was Bill and Mary Campbell.
Yeah.
And it is because of Don Frost that Bill and Mary Campbell were basically taken out, because that Bill wanted to believe that Don had some kind of a message that was going to be greater than that, than what Jeff had been promoting.
Mm-hmm.
And so he pressed very hard throughout the Northwest, and there's a lot of people that chose to listen, and it just created more and more problems.
Yeah. And that influence is still existed in lots of different ways, even though Don Frost is kind of out there a bit.
Well, Frost has been accepted more and more by the General Conference now.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
How so?
they have found some way to get him a position, and they are choosing that they can work with Don Frost rather than work with the truth that's in the Bible of the Spirit of Prophecy.
Well, that's telling.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So anyway, when we look at this chart here, and we're again looking at, so lots of different ideas are coming together, but we look at this history of what was happening at that time. So we have these changes that are going to happen to these lines from this time here, 2011, to 2016. A great deal of change is going to happen to Millerite history, and a lot of people aren't going to be happy with that. So, and we haven't dealt with the Seven Thunders yet. We're going to deal with the Seven Thunders as we go through here, because the Seven Thunders is another way of looking at history at lines, rather than this reform line element. It's part of it, but we're going to see that there's the Seven Thunders ideas and how they were interpreted. But you're going to see here, anyway, in Millerite history, the first angel's message is marked at 1840. So in this time, at least in this chart, they're not putting the first angel arrives in 1798, the second, and it's empowered or formalized and then empowered, and then the second angel arrives and it's formalized and empowered, and then the third angel. So if you looked at this, you would almost just say, well, the first angel's message, it appears that it arrives in 1840. But of course, we know that's not correct. So they don't really have that distinction made here on this chart. And they have some Spanish there, fin de los 2300 años. So, that's probably Spanish, right? The end of the 2300 years being marked. So they didn't change that from when they're editing this chart. Anyway, and then you have the foundation of the faith. So there's a quote from the Southern Watchman, January 24th, 1905, the foundations of faith. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, of course, that would be 1840. The mighty angel of Revelation 10 comes down. So we're going to see that this mighty angel coming down in this context is going to be, now we said it's the little book opened. So that the book of Daniel. But it's also connected to some degree with what happens with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in Revelation 9. So they kind of precedes it, I guess, in that sense. And then you're going to have the Protestants close their doors in June of 1842. So the doors closed, they're marking as 1842. So they don't have April 19th in here. They say the first disappointment is March 21st, 1844. The Midnight Cry, they have in Exeter, August 12th to 17th. So they don't know that it occurred on August 15th. And then they just have the second angels proclaimed through the summer of 1844. And then, so those things, we've added so much detail in that history. Now we're going to find later when Jeff starts to refine these lines and how he looked at it. It's quite a bit different after 9/11. A lot of things changed. So these are lines after 9/11, as you can see when you look at today's line. But they still share a lot of similarity to his initial lines. So he's basically fit things into those lines. Now, if you look at this line here, you're going to have, of course, Millerite history, and then you're going to have Revelation 3:18 to 22, the Laodicean church. So what is he doing here with this big line here? Where is he marking? How is he marking 1, 2, 3 here? It may not be big enough for people to see. I'm going to make this bigger. I don't think I can. Oh, I said I can. There we go. So we're just going to look here at how does he, so because we're thinking about the line of Moses. So the line of Moses, they put the 10 Commandments as the fourth. So what does he have? Revelation 3:18-22, that's the Laodicean church. So what is this implying as he takes this? Where would he mark the Laodicean church beginning?
Just, it's kind of vague. It's kind of like just sometime after 1844.
So he has this bigger line, which he's not taking the lines the way that we would do and put, because if he's taking this as our history, Revelation 18, he's not defining this as the time of the end, 9/11, the Sunday law, as he does now. He basically has this much broader perspective on this big line that it's just, this is the line of Adventism, and we're now going to have this little reform line that's going to be within it, but he's not defining it here as he would in the other lines. So he just has the Laodicean church, so that could be 1850. And then he has the fourth angel's message is Revelation 18. So that's our reform line.
Well, there's a problem because he has the third angel's message not proclaimed. That yellow strip is. It seemed like he would be making like 1888 in there.
Yes.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, and I would say, there's lots of little problems here, but that's one of them. So I wouldn't put the Laodicean condition as the first waymark of the repeat of history. You could say the church is in a Laodicean condition at that time, but that's definitely not the start of the Laodicean condition. But of course, this reform line that he has here, when we go back down to this bottom line, this is, you can see he has Laodicea here at the beginning. So he's just saying the church is in a Laodicean condition. And then you're going to have this collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. Now he's not labeling it the time of the end. And he has this increase of the understanding of prophecy and so forth. So what we're going to do tomorrow, because our time is up, is I'm going to try to draw out how I would deal with the line of Moses and how I would deal with these other lines. So and then we're going to discuss that. We're going to look at it, try to see what makes sense. Any questions before we close with prayer? And do people want me to send out this chart, or does everybody have it, or should I?
Please send it out.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So I'll send out these various charts for us to look at. Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you once again for the time that we could have here this morning to study your word, the spirit of prophecy, and to look at the foundations. And again, we ask for your Holy Spirit's presence as we continue to look in these things each day in our personal study and in our time together. Help us to understand your word, not just for intellectual curiosity, but that we can reflect your character. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.